各位来宾，大家好。大家好。Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be at the Asia Society to enjoy this wonderful facility and such a wonderful audience such as yourselves. It's nice to see a lot of old friends in the audience this evening. It's my deep pleasure to moderate the panel discussion tonight on Taiwan in the 21st century. I'll introduce the panelists, and then we will ask them to give us about a 15-minute prepared commentary, and we'll go from there. If I may first introduce Dr. Rwei-Ren. He is an Assistant Research Fellow at the Institute of Taiwan History at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. He is the author of, among other publications, Toward a Pragmatic Nationalism, Democratization, and Taiwan's Passive Revolution. He has published extensively in both Chinese and Japanese on the modern political and intellectual histories of Taiwan and Japan. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 2003. To advocate the cause of transitional justice in Taiwan, he helped found the Taiwan Association of Truth and Reconciliation in 2008 and has since served on its board. We're also joined by Dr. June Teufel Dreyer. Dr. Dreyer is professor of political science at the University of Miami, Coral Gables, Florida. Formerly senior Far East specialist at the Library of Congress, she has also served as Asia Policy Advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations and as a Commissioner of the United States China Economic and Security Review Commission, established by the United States Congress. Dr. Dreyer is a Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a member of the Board of Scholars of the U.S.-China Research Institute of the University of Southern California, as well as a member of the Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Dr. Dreyer received her bachelor's degree from Wellesley and MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. A frequent visitor to the Far East, Dr. Dreyer's most recent book is China's Political System, Modernization, and Tradition, now in its 8th edition. Ninth edition. Dr. Dreyer serves on the board of editors of Orbis and the Journal of Contemporary China and has received numerous teaching awards. Our third speaker this evening is Mr. J. Michael Cole. Mr. Cole is a Taipei-based journalist, a senior staff member at the Thinking Taiwan Foundation, and a senior non-resident fellow at the China Policy Institute of the University of Nottingham. He has an MA in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada, the International Diploma in Humanitarian Assistance from the Center for International Health and Cooperation, CX 77 in Peacekeeping from the Lester Pearson Peacekeeping Center, and a BA in English Literature. He was deputy news editor and a reporter at the Taipei Times from 2006 to 2013. Prior to moving to Taiwan in 2005, Mr. Cole was an intelligence officer for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He is the author of Smokescreen, Canadian Security Intelligence After September 11, 2001, Democracy in Peril, Taiwan's Struggle for Survival from Chen Shui-bian to Ma Ying-jeou, and of the upcoming Officially Unofficial, Confessions of a Foreign Journalist in Taiwan. We indeed have a panel full of international experts tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Rwei-Ren Wu. I'm now working at the Institute of Taiwan History of Academia Sinica in Taiwan. It's a great honor for me to be able to come here to share some of my thoughts about Taiwan in the 21st century. But before I begin my presentation, I have to apologize for one very simple fact, that I'm very, very tired now. I'm still suffering from some kind of mental and emotional exhaustion from one of the longest spring of Taiwan history. As everybody may know that in March and April, and we witnessed two consecutive large-scale social movements in Taiwan, which may have rewritten the history of the island. And I was deeply involved in both of the movements, and it was really very exhausting, both physically and emotionally. So this is one of the reasons, and on top of that, I'm still suffering from jet lag. So, and anyway, somehow I managed to prepare a last-minute speech notes. So, if you would forgive me, I would like to read it through. Yeah, I try to control my time, within 15 minutes. So I will begin. And the theme of this panel is, in fact, for me, rather problematic, even tragic. For Taiwan, it's by no means a normal case of international politics on which one can have a happy and easygoing conversation. To discuss Taiwan's role in the 21st century, one must answer the inconvenient question of what is Taiwan first. For one must know what Taiwan is, what situation it is placed in, and what it wants and aspires to before one can reasonably expect or extrapolate the possible role or roles it might play in the 21st century. And yet, if one gets too deeply into these questions, one risks being so troubled by the abysmal Taiwanese realities that one becomes speechless. It becomes even worse if you happen to come from Taiwan, like me, and your personal fate is bound up with the fate of the island, because now Taiwan becomes an existential problem. So I will have to ask for your forgiveness at the beginning of my presentation if what I'm going to say sounds a bit too personal and too philosophical, and at times cynical and disenchanted. I can't help it. Taiwan is both personal and fate. So tonight I will not address the topic directly. Instead, I will address the question of what is Taiwan, and then by doing so, I hope to respond to our topic indirectly. Now, I will sum up my answers to these questions about what Taiwan is before I elaborate my thoughts on these matters. Well, I will say my conclusion first. First of all, Taiwan. What is Taiwan? Taiwan is a largely formed nation-state with a distinct national identity of its own that, although still somewhat unstable, is being increasingly strengthened and consolidated by the powerful integrative mechanism of its democratic institutions. Second, the Taiwanese national identity, like all other national identities in the world, was not manufactured by this or that, shrewd politician. Rather, it is an unintended consequence of a long and complex historical processes that are beyond anyone's manipulation. Thirdly, the historical geopolitical structure of East Asia, that is, multiple imperial centers fighting over a common periphery, contributed substantially to the formation of the Taiwanese state in the past, but the same structure is now constraining the further development and the final completion of the state formation process. This is the predicament of Taiwan now. An increasingly self-determining and independent island nation is being imprisoned in an increasingly hardened geopolitical cage. Fourth, the only way out of this predicament does not lie in joining any superpower-dominated regional military economic alliance, but in connecting with the global civil society, as I see it. That is, to further regional peace, not through balance of power, but through building a progressive coalition of regional civil societies based on democratic values that might contain and check great power politics and nationalistic rivalries. This is how I envision Taiwan's escape from its geopolitical predicament, but this is also how I imagine its role should be in East Asia in the 21st century. Now, to envision Taiwan's future must begin with some knowledge of how Taiwan came into being in the past. Let me give you a very brief account of how Taiwan as a nation-state was formed historically. The history of Taiwan is a complicated history of how a colony over time became a nation-state. From a historical sociological point of view, we can observe this process from two analytical levels. That is, the society and the state. On the societal level, the trend was from fragmentation to integration. Like the American society, Taiwanese society was constituted by both the Aboriginal peoples and many different groups of settlers who came to the island at different points of time. Like America, it took almost 3 centuries for Taiwan to overcome the deep ethnic animosities and complete the process of settler indigenization and social integration. It was on the basis of this social integration and indigenation that a Taiwanese national identity gradually came into being, first in the 1920s. On the level of the state, Taiwan's experience of successive colonial rule since the 17th century, they bring about a highly discontinuous political history, and yet the same process simultaneously contributed to the formation of a state through the institutional accumulation of different successive colonial regimes. For instance, Japan inherited a system of social control, baojia, and land ownership from the Qing Empire, but introduced institutions of modern state to Taiwan. The KMT regime largely inherited the overdeveloped state apparatus created by the Japanese, but brought to the island a sovereign state form, that is, the Republic of China. This process of the accumulation of state institutions took place within the territorial boundaries of Taiwan, which eventually turned the island frontier into a territorial state. The earlier process of social integration, indigenization, and institutional accumulation converged in the 1990s with the process of democratization, thereby profoundly shaping the form of contemporary Taiwanese state. More specifically, through the process of democratization, Taiwanese people who had been excluded from the sharing of political power inherited the emigre Republic of China and then transformed it into a democratic state of their own. The national identity of the Taiwanese people is now manifested on various levels, institutional levels. For one thing, the everyday working of the institutions of a sovereign state is reproducing Taiwan's existence as a state, day in and day out. For another, the everyday functioning of democratic institutions in Taiwan is affirming and reproducing at a very steady pace the Taiwanese existence as a civic nation, day in and day out, if one follows Ernest Renan's classic definition of nation as daily plebiscite. There are some caveats, to be sure. Although the national identity of the Taiwanese people has been largely formed, the symbolic content of this national identity is still in this dispute. Moreover, the sovereign statehood of Taiwan is, in public international laws is still not yet stable due to the exclusion of Taiwan from the UN system of sovereign states. Last but not least, the formation of the Taiwanese state during the post-World War II period was completed under the protection of the American hegemony of the Cold War era. In essence, Taiwan had remained up to until 2008 an exclusively American protectorate. Now it's a protectorate to both United States and China. And all in all, Taiwan should be understood as a nation state that is approaching its maturity, and the powerful integrative function inherent in the participatory process of Taiwan's democracy is increasingly strengthening and consolidating the national identity of the Taiwanese people. Here, actually, I put in some statistics of the condition of Taiwanese identity, but I feel it extremely strange to quote statistics about my own identity. So, and also because of the limitation of time, so I will just skip this part. I'm sorry, Jinru. I will tell you the story after the event. But anyway, Taiwan is on its way of becoming a mature nation state. Its people's identity with the state is getting stronger and more consolidated, each day. If left to itself, its own, there will be no turning back of the process, as there is no turning back of the clock. For this is not a trick of any shrewd politicians, but the outcome of a big structural forces and long-term historical processes. And this is an empirical observation, although not without some political implications. Be that as it may, the geopolitical structure that had partially engendered the Taiwanese state in the past is now constraining and preventing, if not reversing, the completion of this process. As the great historical sociologist Perry Anderson observes, China will never never abandoned its irredentist claim over Taiwan, since it imagines itself not as an empire, but as a nation-state. And the boundary of the nation-state is sacred and is never allowed to be separated or seceded. Faced with the rise of China, the U.S. has chosen to contain the Taiwanese aspiration for independence by adopting a policy of strategic ambiguity, playing Taiwan as a pawn in its structural conflict with China. The offensive realist John Mearsheimer from U of Chicago, my alma mater, is even more pessimistic and blunt. He has already said that say goodbye to Taiwan, since it is in his mind too late for the U.S. to effectively contain the rise of China as a regional hegemon in East Asia. So Taiwan has no way to go but to be locked into the Chinese sphere of influence. It seems that in most scenarios, Taiwan's fate is sealed. The domestic growth and aspirations of a Taiwanese national identity and the reality of an actually existing and functioning democratic state are nothing but sounds and furies signifying nothing in the eyes of the superpowers. It seems that the history is being reversed as of now, and the state form is to be unformed. The historically formed aspirations of the Taiwanese people for self-determination and independence, and Taiwan's geopolitical situation of being caught up in a structural conflict of two superpowers are clearly on a collision course. Moreover, the rise and expansion of China has triggered a new wave of reactive nationalism in neighboring East Asian countries, which is further complicating the original structural conflict. East Asia, from north to south, is in a highly volatile and dangerous situation, and Taiwan is probably in a most vulnerable position. Is there any practical way out of this predicament for Taiwan? So next section, I title the next station, Quo Vadis Formosa. Quo Vadis Formosa, a freedom-aspiring island imprisoned in the East Asian geopolitical cage. To be honest, I don't think there is a geopolitical solution to the Taiwanese predicament. And if geopolitical structure is beyond control, all the weak and small can do is try to become stronger by themselves. If there is no way out in international realpolitik, then the weak and small must find a way somewhere else, become stronger, and advance in a roundabout route. This is a moral rule for the pariah in international politics to survive in the jungle of international anarchy. But specifically, what can Taiwan do given its current plight? Let us examine the difficulties Taiwan is now facing. In the larger context of the structural conflict between the U.S. and China, a subtle change has begun since 2008 that has been pushing Taiwan into the Chinese sphere of influence. The KMT government has adopted a pro-China stance during the past 6 years out of myopic motivations. In the meantime, China has been using the neoliberal logic to execute the grand strategy of besieging politics with business, 以商为政, in dealing with Taiwan. That is, to buy off instead of to conquer militarily Taiwan. A structure of political economic dependence of Taiwan on China is rapidly emerging as of now. Faced with the double siege of new liberalism and the new imperialism, Taiwan must first strengthen its own self-determining capabilities. What I mean here is not to embark on an anachronistic nation building from above, but rather a movement of civic patriotism. Specifically, we need to push for the consolidation and deepening of Taiwan's democracy by way of a political and social movement from bottom up. And in doing so, we hope to build a just police that protects public interest and embodies universal progressive values. In other words, I'm proposing to strengthen and protect Taiwan's de facto independence and democracy through more democracy and more progressive politics. In fact, this is what has been happening in Taiwan during the past 6 years. A new wave of democratic movement with NGOs, university professors, and students instead of political parties as its center emerged in 2008, and it has since become a powerful force in consolidating Taiwan's nascent democracy. The outbreak of the recent Sunflower Movement in March was, in a sense, a culmination of this wave of democratization in Taiwan. The new generation of angry young activists did not just come out of nowhere. They were the outcome of long and patient education, organization, and mobilization by many on the grassroots level during the past 20 years of democratization. In other words, the first stage of democratization created a vibrant civil society, which has in turn become the new agent of the subsequent democratic consolidation and deepening. Democratization has empowered and energized the Taiwanese people, thereby transforming Taiwan into a genuinely self-determining political community. At any rate, in signaling a firm yes to Taiwan and a firm no to China's new liberal Trojan force of buying off Taiwan, the new democratic movement in Taiwan may have shaken loose somewhat the double siege of capital and empire and opened up a new path for Taiwan. This is what I meant by self-strengthening. But where is the external roundabout route that I talk about? The democracy of Taiwan on the democratic front has created a positive image with high legitimacy that in turn points to a way out of a plight, that is the global civil society. Taiwan has been excluded by the UN system unjustly, but it experienced a reversal of fortune in the 90s and has been since accepted as a member by the global civil society, thanks to the moral image created by its own efforts in democratization. The global civil society has provided an open, progressive and truly universal system of international cooperation alternative to that of the UN monopolized sovereign state system. If Taiwan is not allowed to participate in the power games of sovereign states, at least it still has a chance to be part of an idealistic career dedicated to the common interests of the human beings. Realism is not the only name of the game. Besides, we should not forget that the global civil society and the UN system are not two parallel worlds, but two related constituent parts of the same world. Through applying various international human rights laws to the domestic laws, Taiwan has long established indirect but real connection with the universal human rights system led by the UN. As naive as it may sound, I am not enthusiastic about the idea of Taiwan participating in a regional military alliance, whether it's dominated by the U.S. or China. Depending on military alliance for its protection would only expose Taiwan to more danger of war. For in such an asymmetric alliance, a small state like Taiwan has greater risk of getting involved in conflict, since it has more difficulties refusing the military demand from the big state, like Okinawa. And as the political philosopher John Rawls points out, peace brought out by the intimidation of military force is merely a modus vivendi based on the balance of power. In the long run, we should pursue stability for the right reason, in his own words. That is, we should pursue peace by spreading democracy. As democracy is indeed the most precious soft power of Taiwan, it constitutes one of the most credible grounds for pursuing a Kantian notion of democratic peace for Taiwan. In an East Asia where the structural conflicts of great powers are becoming increasingly intractable and the nationalistic fervor of regional countries caused by historical hatred and territorial disputes is rapidly on the rise, Taiwan is powerless in changing the bleak state-centered geopolitical realities. However, the path of civil society-centered democratic peace that I suggest for Taiwan may provide a feasible alternative to jingoistic nationalism and territorial expansion prevalent in this area now. I believe that a progressive network of East Asian civil societies can reasonably check, if not totally contain, the conflicts among states motivated by selfish geopolitical interests. And this is where democratic countries in this region, such as Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, enter the picture. Since there is a lot they can do to help develop civil society in less democratic countries such as China. Now, in place of conclusion, okay, please allow me to quote a passage from an article that I published last year, which is on Japan's reconciliation with East Asian neighbors. I think it's highly relevant to this to the topic of today, so I would like to quote it. And in the passage, the thing I said about Japan, apply to Taiwan and all other East Asian countries too. So please allow me to read it, and then I will conclude. The actual emergence of a civil society in China, thanks to the efforts of both indigenous and international civil-minded actors, opened up a new channel for Japan to engage China other than state and market. We believe this new channel, this emergent civil society, provides a better and more meaningful way to reaching a lasting reconciliation between the two countries than any modus vivendi reached between state leaders. Only by providing aid for and working with the Chinese people to build an autonomous civil society through sincere, solid, and patient public project that helps and heals those victimized by both state and market in a fast-changing country can Japan begin to expect to come by any kind of trust that the deeply traumatized Chinese people have long refused them. Trust lost politically can only be reborn socially with humility and civility. This logic also applies to Taiwan and China, to the relationship between Taiwan and China, the relation between Korea and Japan, and to East Asia in general, and to other parts of the world torn by historical hatred. The democracy in China is a dream afar, but it is a dream worth pursuing collectively because it is one indispensable building block for a truly meaningful East Asia community. East Asian community, it is not a euphemized repackaging of the cliched regional geopolitical bloc, but the ultimate manifestation of an East Asian civil society. It is high time that Japan and Taiwan and Korea, for that matter, took its first step. This is how I imagine a way out of the geopolitical predicament for Taiwan, and this is also how I imagine the role of Taiwan could play in the coming years of the 21st century. Last, I would like to just quote one sentence by the famous political scientist Robert Kilhan. When he talked about a small state, he said, in his own words, the little Lilliputians, how can they bind the giant golfer and make him move? Yeah, I think, and we shall know that, in this enigmatic question, hidden in this enigmatic question is something that, that beyond the recognition, beyond the understanding of realists, is something about the principle of hope and the power of the powerless. Thank you very much.
Dajiahao. I have to apologize. I would be the second person second speaker today who is completely burnt out after 24 days of occupation at the legislature. I had nothing to do with it personally, except that I was very busy covering it as a journalist and did not sleep a whole lot during those 24 days. And it's bizarre. I spent so much time at protests in recent months that I was looking at the back of the room with the chairs and the white signs on them, and initially I thought those were police shields. So it's time for me to take a bit of a break from these things, I guess. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Asia Society for inviting us today to talk about Taiwan more specifically. A country that sometimes, unfortunately, people forget to consider or even mention when discussing that very, very important part of the world. Before I go on, I would have to state that the views that I am expressing today are not necessarily reflected by my current employer, nor is my current employer dictating those views. And for those who do not know yet, my current employer is Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, former chairperson of the DPP. Those are my personal views. Talking about Taiwan in the 21st century is actually very challenging, if only because there is so much uncertainty surrounding not only its future, but even its current situation. It is a very ill understood place, especially among people who do not live on the island. Looking forward in its all-important relations with China, I would say that the last thing that Beijing wants to do with regards to Taiwan is to use force and to deploy its increasingly impressive PLA in a full-on invasion of Taiwan. The costs of doing so, both in human terms as well as in China's ability to continue its development, would be tremendous. That being said, it doesn't mean that China's intentions when it comes to Taiwan, Dr. Wu mentioned irredentism, for example, they have not changed despite the 6 years or so of détente that we have seen since the election of President Ma Ying-jeou in 2008, following somewhat more tense 8 years under President Abien or Chen Shui-bian. I believe, though, that recent events in Taiwan, more specifically the Sunflower Movement, have made it clear that the détente is possibly over. The Sunflower Movement and the constellation of small civic organizations that mobilized over the past 2 years that did not receive a lot of attention in the media, were largely ignored by pretty much everybody except me and my wife, and Dr. Wu, we saw a snowballing of activism in at least the past 2 years, starting with an alliance against the monopolization of the media in Taiwan at a time when a pro-China businessman tried to acquire the operations of Next Media in Taiwan. And then issue after issue after issue, we saw a snowballing of civil society and, more importantly, cross-pollination of issues. We saw more and more familiar faces taking the lead, sharing the leadership, providing support to different organizations that all mobilized and stood up against a government that had grown increasingly deaf, if you will, to public demands, whether it be trade issues with China, the demolition of neighborhoods across Taiwan, demolition of a Lesheng sanatorium, laid off workers. There's a number of issues that emerged in the past 2 years, and civil society felt it needed to take action because the government was perceived to be increasingly non-responsive, but also the fact that, unfortunately, the main opposition party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, had itself become neutralized and was incapable of countering the policies of the Kuomintang-led government or even to propose policy alternatives. They were too busy fighting amongst each other. They were too neutralized. So civil society, and I spoke with a lot of them, and they're like, well, Michael, we consider you a Taiwanese now. But, you know, you still have a Canadian passport. If things go from bad to worse in Taiwan, you can jump on the plane and go back to your country. We have nowhere to go. We need to fight for our country. And starting about 2 years ago, and in my view, this is not by accident because it does coincide with the emergence of President Xi Jinping in China, we have seen an intensification of the pressure that is being applied on Taiwan and has translated into the adoption of policies by the Ma Ying-jeou administration that are, again, increasingly distant from the public and are in certain ways becoming what I like to call authoritarian light. I remember back in 2008, I was taken aback when Ma Ying-jeou said that his role model in how to run the country was Singapore. Now, Singapore is not North Korea, obviously, but it also isn't a very vibrant democracy. So it's kind of stuck in between, and the state will not hesitate to use the courts or police or other mechanisms of state repression to silence anyone who dares oppose the government policies. The past 2 years under Ma Ying-jeou, starting with his second term, and as I said, I do believe that the emergence of Xi Jinping as the leader in China has something to do with it. The KMT seems to have lost the initiative on cross-strait negotiations. Interestingly enough, Ma Ying-jeou's former National Security Council Secretary General, Suu Kyi, himself told a conference in the UK last year that things were going too fast in the Taiwan Strait, that the KMT had lost its ability to set the agenda. So this has very much put the KMT-led government in a reactive position, and China seems to have realized this and used this to increase the pace of developments across the Taiwan Strait. And in many ways, Ma has adopted policies that I don't necessarily think he wants to adopt, but he has little choice because the expectations from the China side have become much greater. And from friend journalists who are based in China who look every day at policymaking in China, Xi Jinping does not come across as someone who is very patient. In my view, first of all, Taiwan remains one of the top priorities for the Chinese Communist Party. And secondly, Xi Jinping has very ambitious goals for China. And currently, Taiwan stands in the way. He wants to resolve the Taiwan quote-unquote issue once and for all, and then move on to greater things within the region. So I'm not so sure that Ma is willingly complicit in the assault on democracy that we have seen in recent years, but he's certainly responsible in that he has not found alternatives to dealing with opposition coming from within society. At the same time, we have seen the return to Taiwan after 16 years in forced exile of people like Zhang Anle, also known as the White Wolf, who is not only pro-unification, but also started his own pro-unification party while in China. He was allowed to return to Taiwan back in June last year, was a free man, and has been able to go around the country and intimidate and threaten, and on some occasions use violence in a way that plays into China's irredentist aims vis-a-vis Taiwan. I lived dangerously last year. I visited his office in Taipei, unannounced, and I saw two very, very interesting things in his office. Is a gigantic CCP flag at the back of a conference room and hundreds of photographs of him shaking hands with senior CCP officials from across China. His goals are very, very clear, and for some reason, law enforcement authorities in Taiwan are not dealing with him. What this means in terms of social stability, what it means in terms of what the government would allow by certain segments of society that are pro-unification raises very serious questions. And as I said, currently the KMT and probably Beijing have the DPP where they want it. The DPP has been unable to act as a important counter to the current administration in Taipei. And they themselves at internal meeting 2-3 weeks ago admitted that they completely missed the boat on social issues in civil society, for example. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. government, the sole guarantor of security for Taiwan and its principal ally when it comes to defense cooperation, has been largely inattentive to what is going on in Taiwan. It is rather shocking when I hold discussions with U.S. officials based in Taipei or U.S. officials in Washington, D.C., or academics who are regarded as experts on Taiwan, how little they know. They never saw the Sunflower Movement coming, for example, and according to a lot of them, this was a spontaneous, irrational, violent reaction by mostly students in Taiwan who apparently, according to them, have nothing better to do than go protest on the street or occupy government buildings, or if they enjoy it, get beaten up by cops. If they actually were paying attention, they would realize that the tensions within Taiwanese society are much greater than people believe. On the surface, relations between Taiwan and China over the past 6 years have indeed been very stable, and we have had the illusion, if you will, that things are progressing in a peaceful manner. This is true on the surface, but as this occurs, we are seeing an increasing build-up of, I wouldn't call it anti-China sentiment. Most Taiwanese I've spoken with, from young students to cab drivers in Kaohsiung or night market vendors, they're like, I have nothing personally against China, and I certainly do not hate their money. I would not hesitate to send my children to China to study or even to work in China for Chinese companies. But what they do fear is the impact and the interests of China when it comes to potentially absorbing Taiwan. And their main fear right now, which finally is no longer abstract, but is really starting to take shape in Taiwan, is the impact on Taiwan's democracy. And I mean, to misquote Francis Fukuyama, democracy is not the end of history. Once a country democratizes, it does not mean that all is fine and well. What is also very important for countries is the quality of their democracy. Taiwan's democracy was not, starting with the first direct elections in 1996, it was not perfect. It's a deeply flawed democracy. And now it seems to be under tremendous pressure from China, from the business community, and from more conservative elements within the Kuomintang to curtail certain of its functions. And civil society in Taiwan is really aware that those are crucial. This is why I like to refer to what we're seeing in Taiwan as civic nationalism. It no longer is based along ethnic lines. It no longer is based along voting preferences. Now what we are seeing is people, young and old, educated and not, wealthy or poor, they're all coming together fighting for the values and the way of life that they regard as the spirit of Taiwan, if you will, and what makes that place extraordinary. Which gives me great hope. I know people tend to be pessimistic about Taiwan. To me, the past 2 years have been a very important lesson in terms of Taiwan's resilience. The young people especially have made it very clear that there are certain lines that they will not allow the authorities to cross. And some of those lines were crossed in recent months, and we saw what happened. They occupied the legislature. Little known fact, the Ministry of the Interior building was occupied for 24 hours last night. It never got reported in international news, but already they had demonstrated their ability to take action and to defy the authorities. So this has been escalating. This is not necessarily a new phenomenon. My fear, though, is that civil society cannot run a government. We still need elected officials to implement policies. I hope that civic activism will eventually translate into decision makers taking more of Taiwanese expectations into consideration when they fashion their policies, and that this will lead to officials being elected who are better able to reflect those expectations, whether they be in the DPP or the Kuomintang. I believe that Sunflower Movement, and whatever happens next, because they are not going away, will translate into pressure on whoever wants to run for the KMT, not only for president, but also in local elections. We will have 7-in-1 elections in November this year. KMT, whether it likes it or not, operates in a democracy. They want to be elected. Now the public in Taiwan has made it very clear that there are certain things that they expect from government officials and that they will take action if those are not delivered upon. I'm convinced that this will translate in more responsible governance from both parties. Already the DPP has said we need to connect with civil society again. We have failed miserably over the past 2 years. And I am fully confident that there are some elements within the KMT who have reached the same conclusions. Now, that being said, China's aims for Taiwan have not changed. I am convinced, however, that Beijing is fully aware of what is going on within Taiwanese society right now. Their rhetoric constantly refers to small pockets of pro-independence splitists and all that. Actually, the Beijing government is a lot more refined in its understanding of what is going on in Taiwan. And I would dare say that their understanding is a lot better at this point than that of American officials, for example. And I do really, really hope that U.S. officials realize what is going on in Taiwan, realize that there are tremendous tensions. There is a reckoning, there is a clash at some point unless Beijing changes its policies and decides it no longer wants to absorb Taiwan. We will have a clash. I fear that if action is not taken by the international community to prevent this happening, that at some point we could see a bloodbath in Taiwan. either as a result of PLA intervention or even by security forces in Taiwan. Both sides right now, the activists, civic movements, NGOs, professors who support them, and the media who support them are not backing down. But the government is not backing down either and has been adopting, as I said earlier, policies that are increasingly self-authoritarian. We now have the specter of preventive detention in Taiwan, which we had not seen in several years. They have enlarged the definition of the crimes that can be targeted by preventive detention. We now have 3 different units that are targeting the new media and that are countering disinformation and falsehoods on the internet and social media, the very same social media that allows social movements to mobilize. This is very reminiscent of what we have seen in China for a number of years. So in conclusion, my fear is that if nothing is done and we keep seeing greater influence by China and Taiwan, we might see a repeat of what we saw recently in Crimea, where the Chinese government believes that it needs to intervene to maintain security, to maintain stability in its near waters, and takes action to defend those. The example or the precedent set by Crimea with the Western community not standing up to Russia is a very dangerous lesson learned by the Chinese government, which also might think it could get away with similar actions. So it's time to stop pretending that all is swell in the Taiwan Strait. There are tremendous pressures building right now, and I do believe that for the U.S. government, it is grand time that officials, ambassadors, people at the State Department abandon their Patrick Hurley approach to China that, again, likes to think that everything is fine and all that. Things are not fine in Taiwan right now. Thank you very much.
I was asked to address the topic of Taiwan in the future, Taiwan in the 21st century. And this is to ask a prediction. And when somebody asks me to make predictions, I always think of my favorite philosopher, who is almost as distinguished as the ones that Dr. Wu has mentioned. But this is Yogi Berra. And Yogi Berra said that prediction is always difficult, especially about the future. And Taiwan's past history, you know, what's past is prologue, and Taiwan's past history is full of unexpected surprises. For example, it looked like Mao Zedong, it was only a matter of time before Mao Zedong's legions invaded Taiwan. And then along came the Korean War in 1950, and that essentially Truman sent in the 7th Fleet to, quote, neutralize the Taiwan Strait, and that saved Taiwan. And then there was this period from 1972 through 1979, the period of normalization, and a lot of people shook their heads and said, Taiwan is going to be absorbed by China after, quote, a decent interval. Nobody was quite sure what the interval was. And then along came the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979 and the democratization of Taiwan. And as a friend of mine who's a great supporter of Taiwan once put it, Taiwan is an inconvenient democracy. It's inconvenient because the United States cannot afford to sacrifice a democracy and not stand behind it. So that saved Taiwan. And then again, in the period 2004-2005, it looked like the EU, the European Union, was going to lift the embargo on arms to China. And this was very nerve-making, not only to Taiwan, but also to Japan. And then what happened, there's a wonderful Chinese expression that you picked up a rock only to drop it on your own foot. And what happened was China passed the anti-secession law, and at that point, the United States and the EU said, okay, that's it. You know, we're not lifting that embargo. Okay? And so honestly, I have watched Taiwan since 2008 slowly slip further and further and further into the uncomfortable orbit of China. Every one of these agreements that Ma Ying-jeou trumpets he signed makes it a little worse. And I basically had given up hope, and then came the sunflowers. And really, this has energized Taiwan supporters tremendously. So it seems likely there'll be more surprises. The ones I've given you have been good surprises. Unfortunately, there might be a bad surprise. But so what about this future then? The future is unpredictable, but certain scenarios seem more likely than others. And just for convenience sake, and because I don't want to keep you here past midnight, I'm going to divide them into internal scenarios and external scenarios. Internally, a best case scenario would be that this tremendous civic activism you've seen, and don't believe the media when they tell you this is just a student movement, it's not. This tremendous civic activism carries through. It is not that the legislative yuan is going to be occupied every few weeks, so these gentlemen die of exhaustion. But to the extent where Taiwan's leaders realize there are certain areas they have to be accountable for, and therefore they're not even going to try to do sneaky tricks like sneak the CSSTA, the Cross-Strait Agreement on trade, through and ram it through the legislative yuan illegally and improperly. They're just not going to think of that because they're going to remember that these civic groups are watching them. And so that's a good thing. Now, if the less good scenario, internal scenario, is Taiwan is absorbed into China, and in that case, say optimist, well, you know, Taiwan will be allowed to retain its culture and its language and so on, and its particular styles of doing things, because look, you know, in China, we've got a lot of provinces and they have their own style of cuisine, and at least among each other, they speak their native, whether you want to call this a dialect or a language. I'm not going to get into that argument, but I can promise you, for example, if I was very interested in ethnic minorities, and you go to Yunnan and you find people will not speak Mandarin, they want to speak their own distinctive version of it. I see Dr. Wu is nodding. You've been through that same kind of thing. Yeah. And so Taiwan would be a province of China, but, you know, basically not that much has changed. I'm not that optimistic. And if you look at Hong Kong, which in many ways is not Taiwan, but is a lot closer to China, certainly in terms of proximity, there has been constant pressure, despite this so-called agreement that was signed in 1984. And for example, Hong Kong has a court of final appeal, but that's been overridden by Beijing. And if you're cynic about it, and there are quite a few of them, they call it the court of not so quite final appeal. And then Hong Kong was promised democracy because they didn't have it, and or at least they did not have the right of election. They had plenty of democracy under British control. But so Beijing keeps reneging on promises, and the bottom line is Hong Kong is not going to be allowed to vote until Beijing is sure that it will vote for the person Beijing has pre-selected. That ain't democracy. So there is a tendency for states even far less authoritarian than China to view any manifestation of differentness as an undermining trying to undermine the central government. And so, for example, Taiwan, part of Taiwan culture is Taiwanese puppet theater, very interesting and fun to watch. And I can guarantee you that some censor in Beijing is going to look at a Taiwan puppet show and say, that's subversive. We've got to wipe that out. And, you know, I admit that one of the few manifestations of pop culture I'm not into in the United States is the Game of Thrones. My son is really big into it. But it seems that the Beijing censors have hacked it to pieces because Dragonstone in the Game of Thrones reminds them of Taiwan. You see what I mean? No way is Taiwan under Chinese control going to be allowed to keep its regional distinctiveness. They're probably even going to try to wipe out the cuisine. Okay, so now what about that external scenario? A lot's been happening recently in the Asia-Pacific that has a bearing on Taiwan's continued existence as a nation. And a lot of it has to do with the behavior of China. Beginning in 1999, and I don't know if many of you don't have any reason to remember this, but 1998, the Cox Report was released. That is, the unclassified version was released. And even the unclassified version, by the way, this is a bipartisan, it was a unanimous vote of a bipartisan commission in Congress. And they concluded that China had stolen every nuclear warhead deployed or not yet deployed in the United States arsenal. A little scary. And so 1999, Congress mandates that the Department of Defense every year produce a report on the armed forces of the People's Republic of China with particular reference toward Taiwan, the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. And it was very interesting to me that for years, this report, which is itself politicized, but I haven't got time to mention that, this report kept talking about just the balance in the Taiwan Strait and how it was eroding. And then about 5-6 years ago, this report changed. And it started saying out loud what people had been saying quietly to each other in the Pentagon for years. You know, these weapons aren't needed to take Taiwan. You don't need ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, to take Taiwan. You don't need stealthy aircraft with long ranges. You sure don't need an aircraft carrier. And yet these are being developed. So people start to say, you know, there's a China threat. And this is getting more and more and more obvious. Now, there's a lot of compartmentalization in the Defense Department. One person isn't allowed to know what the other person is doing because it might cause problems. And so I don't know if the people who are preparing this DOD report read Chinese military journals. I read Chinese military journals. And you will find things in there that are pretty scary, not just for the United States, but for Taiwan. And they say things like, after the PRC takes Taiwan, our naval base, there's a big submarine base on Hainan Island. And that naval base, Sanya, and Soyi, which is near Kaohsiung, are going to be the two eyes of the People's Liberation Army. And this is going, Taiwan, another article in Guofang, said that there's this first island chain, and the island chain is encircling China. And we've got to break out of that. And Taiwan is the central point in that first island chain. So we take Taiwan, and then we're out to the second island chain, and then we're going to break through to Guam, and that's breaking through into the open waters of the Pacific. And that should scare the Pentagon. But as I say, I don't know if their analysts read Chinese military journals. Mike Cole just mentioned the appalling ignorance of American officials in Taiwan. The ones in the Pentagon are, I think, a little better, but not a whole lot on many issues. Okay, now, meanwhile, troubles, as you all know, are mounting in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. China's been trying to take over the Senkaku Islands. They call them the Diaoyu. And Professor Wu, I've got to tell you, I think that 30 years of Japanese efforts to engage China civil society have been 100% a failure. So I would put that in your calculations for the Japanese. He taught at Waseda University. His Japanese is fantastic. So next time you go over there, tell him it hasn't worked, okay? All right, and as Vietnam and the Philippines have found out, it doesn't work being nice to China there either, as the Vietnamese are, struggling with this oil rig, Chinese oil rig, which has appeared inside their exclusive economic zone. And the Philippines are having to resupply the Second Thomas Reef by air because the Chinese have Navy has put a blockade around it. So, all right. Now, if Taiwan is part of this chain that's constraining China, it should be obvious to all of these countries, Japan and Southeast Asian countries, that you shouldn't let Taiwan go and be part of China. And Japan undertook this obligation when, as part of the revised defense guidelines in 1998, it agreed to help the defense of the contiguous waters, Shuhenjitai in Japanese. And the PRC tried to get Japan to say that they, those of you who dealt with Japan, that they thrive on ambiguity. I mean, trying to get somebody to say yes or no in Japan it's an art form. But anyway, so the Chinese said to the Japanese, okay, we want you to tell us that Shuhenjitai does not include Taiwan. And the Japanese said, oh, well, we'd love to, but we really can't because it's not a geographical thing. It's a situational thing. And so I thought, occasionally I like Japanese ambiguity. All right, so, that's the kind of thing that's happening. And there's a lot of cooperation, essentially in a nascent form going on here. For example, Vietnam is mad at the Chinese, and Japan is mad at the Chinese. And Vietnam and Japan are talking, and the Indians are angry with the Chinese, and so the Japanese are talking to the Indians, and the Indians are talking to the Vietnamese, and Filipinos, well, actually, I hope there's nobody here who's a Filipino nationalist, but as a military ally, the Philippines are hopeless. Hopeless. Okay, now, and people also have been talking to Australia, and these are good signs. And in Japan, a few days ago, something called the Yanai Report was released by an advisory board to the Prime Minister, Mr. Abe Shinzo, recommending that the Constitution be reinterpreted to allow the right of collective self-defense. I mentioned to you before that the Japanese, wonderful, wonderful people and highly competent, they thrive on nuance and ambiguity. And so the argument for the last umpteen years has been that Japan, as a sovereign nation, has the right to defend itself. But according to the Constitution, It can't. Okay? Think about that one for a while. I haven't figured it out. So, since a majority of the Japanese population, poll after poll after poll, they say, we are against changing the Constitution. What the Japanese do when they want to make a change, they reinterpret the Constitution. So what the Unite report said, we think we have to reinterpret the Constitution and that it doesn't actually prevent the right of collective self-defense. So we're making progress here. Now, assuming Taiwan can keep itself from being absorbed by China, the 21st century could see China encircling itself by calling a countervailing coalition into being. Now, so far, all I've said is, the Japanese are talking to the Indians, and the Indians are talking to the Vietnamese, and so on. To some extent, so far, it reminds me of that parable where there are a bunch of mice saying, somebody needs to put a bell on the cat, and none of the mice want to step up and bell the cat. But was it Professor Wu, you brought up the Lilliputians? Yeah, maybe if the mice could get together and try to tie down the cat, then it might work. And now, assuming you think it's a good idea that Taiwan does this, I think one thing that Taiwan might do is try to get better relations with Japan. Mr. Ma has not been very friendly to Japan, and this started, the senior members of the KMT in general have not been very friendly toward Japan. They want to be friends with China. So, for example, in 2006, there was a lovely little park built, a statue put in a park. You remember this. And it was to commemorate the memory of the Yuanjumin, the Taiwanese aboriginals who served in the Japanese Imperial Army and died in the process. And because that park was in a county controlled by the KMT county magistrate had the statue destroyed. You don't do something like that. I mean, this is really an insult. And then again, after Ma was elected, the Japanese representative, the ambassador equivalent of Japan, a gentleman named Saito Masaki, said in a speech to a university audience, and it was even a private university, that the status of Taiwan is as yet undetermined. And this is actually a boon to Taiwan's continued sovereignty, because the alternative, remember, Japan likes ambiguity. So they never said, they said to China, we agree with you, there's one China. They didn't say which one it was. Okay, so now Ma got furious about to Saito-san and cut him out of presidential briefings, and the guy eventually was recalled to Tokyo. I don't know when you go to Waseda the next time, please find out for me what's happened to him. I hope his career hasn't suffered for telling the truth. But in any case, you see what I mean? I mean, these are examples of people in Taiwan dissing the Japanese. And Japan is one of the few countries in a position to help here. Now, certainly the Taiwan people would support closer relations with Japan. There was a poll released just a couple of days ago. It said 43% of Taiwan citizens said Japan was their favorite country. And the United States, China, and Singapore got single digits only. And among the younger group, people aged 20 to 29, 54% said Japan was their favorite foreign country. Only 2% chose China. And in Japan, 67% of Japanese said they felt either very close or really close to Taiwan, as opposed to 90% of Japanese say they have either a very unfavorable or a relatively unfavorable view of China. Okay, now, Taiwan should also try to quietly approach some of these other countries who are fearful of Chinese encroachment and talk to them about the strategic importance of Taiwan. You let us go, you're in a more vulnerable position yourself. And that needs to be made clear. Another thing Taiwan ought to do, and they really need to do this soon, is to emphasize Taiwan's separate identity. And you saw the folly of identifying with China. In fact, it's going on now in Vietnam. Taiwanese factories are being attacked by people who don't realize that Taiwan isn't China. And somebody sent me a copy of a badge that's being worn and in Vietnam, and it says, "I'm not Chinese, I'm Taiwanese," in English and Vietnamese. And I don't know how that sits with Ma Ying-jeou, who thinks he's Chinese. But in any case, if the Taiwan people have the will to stop this incremental absorption, not because, as has been alleged, they fear globalization, but because China is not any other country, and because there's a good way to do globalization that's favorable to your country, and there's a bad way to do globalization. Now, if this is the kind of future that I hope for in Taiwan in the 21st century, and it's that the people of Taiwan get to decide for themselves where they fit, who they belong to, what their identity is, and it's for them to decide, not for outsiders, whether those outsiders be in Beijing or in Washington. Nobody should decide the future of Taiwan but the people of Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for some very thoughtful, very thought-provoking comments from the panelists this evening. One of the themes that emerges from the discussion from each of you is the reemergence or the strengthened presence of civil society in Taiwan, especially as demonstrated by the Sunflower Movement. It was only, I'd say, no more than a year ago, 6 months ago, when this young generation in Taiwan was characterized as strawberry generation. Pretty to look at, but too tender, bruises easily. And then from out of that comes the Sunflower Movement. You each kind of hit on some of the particular policy triggers for this movement. But how did we go from 0 to 100? Or was the perception of the strawberry generation a little misguided? Start with Michael.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, it did go from 0 to 100, but it did so gradually. The main problem, in my view, with coverage of social movements in Taiwan is that until they did something dramatic, they were completely ignored. And the government itself also ignored them. I must have been to 60 different protests in the past 2 years. Each and every one of them was a slight escalation on the previous one, and it turned into a guerrilla warfare kind of protesting as well. With small groups, highly unpredictable. They would show up at one point, send this information, go somewhere else, and then have the police, catch the police off guard and all that. They learned a lot of lessons. They had input from the some survivors, if you will, of the wild lily movement, and from the wild strawberry movement as well, that had mobilized against the visit of Chen Yulin back in November 2008. In fact, Lin Fei-fan, one of the student leaders among the Self-Power movement, was himself a member of the Wild Strawberries, and he was in high school at the time. So they learned a lot of lessons from their previous mobilization against the government. So the perception out there is that it went from 0 to 100 very fast, but actually it took at least 2 years before we saw that consolidation of the civil society that was able, on March 30th, to mobilize anywhere between 350,000 and 500,000 people from all walks of life to support the cause in Taipei. So it was a movement in the making, and as I said in my presentation, I sense that this time around they took action and they did not disappear, because the threat is less and less abstract, and it really, really touches on their own understanding of their own interests. And as I mentioned during lunch today, those young people and not so young people who support them in the past 2 years have seen people die under mysterious circumstances. They have seen entire villages being bulldozed by the government at a time when Vice President Hu Jintao had promised them that their homes would be protected. So now they are seeing a very, very immediate impact of policies that are detrimental to their way of life, to the values that they espouse as Taiwanese. So, and I think it comes in the context of increased pressure from both the Mao administration and possibly from outside investors and perhaps even China. So it's more real for those people.
Thank you, Michael. Jim, did you want to address that, or Dr. Wu as well? I should tell you what, Dr. Wu, if I could tweak the question a little more there, and that is, I mean, given your work with identity formation, in going from 0 to 100, what role has some form of identity coalescence played in mobilizing, articulating the sunflower movement? Is there something new to this, or is this shades of the old conversation about Taiwan identity versus or the ethnic identity argument? Is there something tangibly different in that identity that brings those students together?
Well, actually, there's no ethnic argument in this time. It's a purely civic. And very interestingly, and you see that nowadays, this present generation of student activists, they were linguistically totally assimilated. Basically, very few of them can speak fluent, Taiwanese. But somehow they try to identify with the language of Taiwanese. But many of them were from mainlander families. So you see, so what's I think it's the factor of time. Several factors. The one is the factor of time, because identity formation, takes time. And somehow, the first is the factor of time, and the second is, I mentioned in my presentation, is the factor of the integrative function of democracy. I think it's very big, because from the early 90s, it's been like 20 years of Taiwan's democratization, and this generation of young, activists, for them, democratic participation is like it's ordinary life. Yeah, so for them, by participating in the political process of Taiwan, they somehow, they grow to identify with the political system of Taiwan. It's a natural process. Yeah. And of course, I think that can I add some, do some empirical information about the strawberries? Actually, I think that the date should be traced a little bit earlier to about 2008. Yeah, the wild strawberries movement, because I was there babysitting them for like 2 months. And you see, I personally, I observed, I witnessed firsthand the birth of a political generation. But, at that moment of time, actually, almost, 90% of them were like political laymen. You see, the movement actually, broke up as an accident. You see that the direct reason was that, the Chinese emissary became the Taiwan, after Ma Ying-jeou got elected. And Ma Ying-jeou, welcomed him, received him very warmly. And then many the citizens went to protest, and the Ma Ying-jeou government used excessive police brutality, which angered a lot of citizens. So, and then a group of students, they wanted to do a very quick demonstration protest in front of Xinzhengyuan. And they didn't have any plan. They just want to stay there for like 2 hours and to curse the police and then leave. Some of them even purchase the movie tickets. They're prepared that I'll go there and then just curse the police and then we'll leave and go to see the movies. But somehow the police totally ignore them, and they didn't have a plan. You see, for the internet generation at the time, they didn't know how to organize themselves, so they just put out the information and then they call everybody to come. And actually, like 200 or 300 people come, all students, without political experience. They went there, didn't know how to do, what to do. But then the police, totally ignored them. So what to do, they didn't know. And then they called me. So I went there. One of the organizers was my student. And I asked him, so what are you going to do? He said, I don't know. We thought that we come here and then we leave the whole situation to the mass. 群众，我们交给群众. They have this very instinctive anarchist instinct. Anarchists they don't like organization, right? This generation of young, students, they hate organization, centralization. So they prefer equal participation, and so they refuse to organize themselves. But the problem is that because the police and government totally ignore them, and they feel that they have no exit strategy at all, so they got stuck there in front of the Xinjiang. And then I told them, okay, you don't have a plan. Okay, then organize yourself. I said in Chinese, 开班会吧. Organize yourself. And then this is the first moment, the moment of the birth of a political generation. The moment they organize, they try to organize themselves. But somehow, they failed to really organize themselves successfully. That's the reason. And why it became a movement? They tried to stay in front of Xinjiang for 2 days. And then in the end, they were so exhausted, they told me that we're going to leave, no matter what. Okay, and then they wanted to do a concert before they leave. So they were preparing for a rock concert, okay? But right at that moment, the riot police came. And they were very mild and very nice, actually. They removed all of us, including me, from in front of the Xinjiang and from square. But somehow this very mild police brutality somehow had an aversive effect on the students. The students were angered because this is the first time, this is the political baptism of them. The first time they experienced some form of police brutality. And then at that moment, so we were put inside in a red bus, and then we moved to the campus of National Taiwan University. So I was on the bus, so I counted heads. And then, when we were dropped, I told them to go home. Okay, it's over, go home. And they refused to go home. They said we all agree that we'll go back to, not to the original place, but go to the Liberty Plaza in front of Chiang Kai-shek Memorial. And then actually they did. So everybody went back. And then, because of the broadcasting power of TV, live TV. So at that night, it's like 3,000 students came. And this is the birth of the movement. And still, politically, the movement failed completely because they didn't achieve any of the goals. But somehow they stayed there and managed to stay there and build camps for 2 months. And then out of the movement was born a whole generation of student activists. So almost all the important leaders of Sunflower movement, they experienced, they had their first experience of political movement in the wild sovereignty movement. So I would say that, of course, from 0 to not 100, but still it's a long and incremental process, and in which, I would like to humbly remind each and every one of you that our generation also plays some part, because we try each and every effort to babysit this political layman. And then we are happy to see a very fast political growth of the generation.
It seems to me that what you have is an impressive trajectory here, starting with the Wild Lilies, and which did achieve political goals, right? They got Li Denghui to appoint a commission and achieve their goals. And you see then the wild strawberries and now the sunflowers. And I wasn't lucky enough to be there, as you guys were, but what I could see looked pretty well organized. That there were people hoisting food and water bottles up on pulleys, and there were people leaving and people taking their places.
Give me sunflower.
In the sunflower.
Oh yeah, it's highly
and
organized.
professors came to teach classes,
Yeah,
and people came. Doctors came from the hospital to provide medical care for people who were exhausted, and in the end, of course, they even cleaned up after themselves. And I mean, so we owe Professor Wu and his generation a big help because obviously you taught these kids a lot.
The important thing is to get beaten, by the police, together with the students. That's the crucial thing. You have to do that. You have to have that kind of experience, to be their comrades.
Well, we are just about out of time. I've got one more question for our panel. You all understand with academics, when you say be brief, it means I'll only take an extra 30 minutes. And given Dr. Dreyer's predilection for predictions, within this context of events that still are unfolding in Taipei, throughout Taiwan, in the South and East China Seas, and with regard to cross-strait relations, we have year-end local elections in Taiwan. The legislature all serve concurrent 4-year terms. So the only thing we have is, as far as a midterm election, are these local elections that are coming up here soon. Will the events taking place now and over the last several months still resonate in the elections to come? Is it possible the KMT might become more responsive? Is it plausible to think that the DPP could actually marshal these energies electorally? So I'll let you guys and Yogi Berra think about that. Any of you like to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think the sunflower movement has, if it has accomplished one thing, it has compounded the level of disappointment with the Ma Ying-jeou administration right now. He himself has gotten highly toxic for whoever wants to win in future elections, especially in local elections. I am convinced that as we approach November, there will be some local candidates who will refuse, for example, to have their photos taken with Ma Ying-jeou. And we actually saw this in the previous 71 elections, or special municipality elections. It's only going to be worse this time around. I suspect that their attempt in KMT candidates, their attempt to win the local population will in part have to factor in that opposition that we saw from the sunflower movement. It will mean going against the wishes of the Ma administration, showing themselves as different from whatever it is that the Ma administration was doing right now. With regards to the DPP, I've gotten a lot of very heavy criticism from deep green circles in recent years for being critical of the DPP. When I see the party field, I'm sorry, but dinosaurs to run in cities like Taipei City and New Taipei City, namely Annette Lu, former vice president with Amiens, and Yu Chi-kun in Xinbei. To me, it says that you people have not learned anything, because you are fielding candidates not for their appeal, but somehow because you need to, they did something for you, they did you a favor, and you need to allow them to run one last time. These people have exactly zero chance of winning in those elections, and yet the party allows them to win. If they had learned, they would also realize that they cannot afford to give up on any municipalities across Taiwan. At this moment, the DPP says we don't even need to bother fielding someone in Miaoli, for example, because the KMT has always won in Miaoli. So why should we bother? Well, right now, Miaoli is a mess, and it's run by Liu Zhenhong, who has been highly corrupt, probably behind unexplained debt in recent years. there is a need for change in that electorate. People are calling for alternatives, and then they turn around to the DPP and they're like, there's nobody. And they said they abandoned them, right? So again, I think Taiwan mentioned that a few months ago in Kaohsiung. She says we need to re-engage society. We have grown too distant from the people and from the mandate that we were given as an opposition party. They need to reconnect with society and realize that there are opportunities. They might not win this time around, but they need to cultivate leadership and provide opportunities and alternatives for people. At this point, I'm not sure yet if the DPP has understood those lessons or is willing to implement those. I do hope that my employer, who will very likely become chairperson again, has learned some of those lessons. And she seems to have understood a little more the need to reach out to younger people who might have fresh ideas for their communities as well.
I have a question for you folks, and that is, to what extent is the Sunflower Movement going to change the KMT? And you've been talking about the DPP, but we know that there is a Bantuhua wing of the a Taiwanese part of the KMT, Wang Jinping, for example, and that he certainly gained some respect from the way he handled the LY crisis. And could it not be that candidates in the KMT will become more responsive to the demands of their constituents? So even if the DPP doesn't capitalize on this, that perhaps the movement will achieve some of its goals.
It is my hope, and we certainly saw movement in that direction within the KMT. My prediction a month and a half ago was that the party would turn against Mom, and that he might even be compelled to step down as chairperson. He preempted that by bringing most of his critics over and appointing them as vice chairman of the party. But the Sunflower Movement has definitely succeeded in widening a ideological split within the KMT. And I do suspect, and I did mention that in my presentation earlier, I do suspect that in the long run it would cultivate possibly more accountable forces and elements within the KMT. And that is in itself a very, very positive thing.
Dr. Wu?
Well, political scientists are not a pundit, So prediction is in the realm of a pundit, right? So I really don't know how to predict all those things because, the DPP is definitely going to make some inroads in the coming elections. Not necessarily because of the movement, but because of the gradual decline of the KMP's legitimacy over the years. So this is not the first time. This is a combination of a long series of struggle. And so you see, those who is going to win, for instance, who is very likely to win the central Taichung city mayor election in Jiawan, I think there's no impact whatsoever of some form movement on him because he's going to win, anyhow. Yeah, originally he had made a lot of efforts, and so I don't know, I don't see. And also, the other new possibility is Jiawan City. Jiawan mayor. But Jiawan mayor is not really because of the DPP candidate is not getting a very good chance. Not because of Sunflower, but because of the outgoing mayor. He was indicted. He was indicted, and then he's going to prison. Okay, so there's nothing to do with the Sunflower movement. So I think the Sunflower movement surely undermines the legitimacy of the government, and surely I agree with your observation that there's a potential possibility of a coup d'etat within the party. And my job, of course, you can see he preempted, but you see he lost twice, right? The first time he lost to Wang Jinping at the service trade agreement, and then the second time he lost the anti-nuclear power plant construction. So I think already his power base has already been seriously undermined. So I don't know, because I'm not inside of the party, so I don't know what's the power arrangement. But I would say that, the successors, the contenders, I think they're going to move, a lot more nativist line. It's very palpable, very apparent. I don't know whether, you talk about the resilience of the Taiwanese people. Right? I want to remind everybody the resilience of the KMT party. The KMT's power base is very different from that of the DPP, because in that, KMT actually has a very strong and very effective exchange mechanism. So he built his local power base with exchange. And so I think this is much part of the ideology. Yeah, so I think locally, they are very, the KMT officials and politicians are very resilient and still powerful. So I don't know, I really don't know. So I'm very cautious about it. Yeah, of course, personally, I hope that Xiaoying will win.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion this evening. Thank you very much to Asia Society for providing this venue for discussion. I do encourage you all to keep updated on news and events in Taiwan. You think at the beginning of the 20th century, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. In the middle of the 20th century, it was one of the poorest countries on earth, with a per capita income on par with Nigeria. It was also the Republic of China. At the beginning of the 21st century, it has any number of names, most of which you can't even remember at one time. But I think our speakers said it very well today, where Taiwan's future is a subject for the people of Taiwan, and our job is to help them make those decisions in a safe place, so to speak. Thank you very much, Dr. Wu, Dr. Dreyer, and Mr. Cole.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.